In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and replace a rear axle in an all-wheel drive RAV4 located in the rear suspension. 21mm socket, and we are going to remove the tire. Now we can pull the tire off. So we're going to remove our caliper, but I'm going to do it just from the bracket to the knuckle, leave the caliper intact. So with a 17mm socket, I'm going to break these mounting bolts free. Let's get the bottom one before that completely comes out. Let's get that bottom one out the rest of the way. Now I'm going to use a caliper hook and I'm going to hang that, set it out of the way. So now we can remove our rotor and see those parking brake shoes. So you notice how this tool has this hook on it, opening on both ends. That is for brake springs. Now, if I put it in like that and installed it, it would be clockwise. Counterclockwise is to remove the spring. See how it pulls it right off the hook? And there it is. We're going to do the same over here. Move that hub so the opening is right there. Put the tool right in there. And turn this one would be clockwise. We're going to follow right down to where the springs are that hold it in place. I'm going to get a pair of long needle nose and I'm going to push and turn that pivot so that it's in the open slot. Just like that. Take those out. And then there's one on the other side at 9 o'clock. Now the other side top spring fell out, but what I always do no matter what, I've been doing this for a long time, I still set up the springs the way they were set up in the brakes away from the car. So I'll take that top spring and I'm going to set it at right around 1, 2 o'clock. And I'm going to take the one on this side, set it the same, around 11. Now I'm going to take my center spring out. I do have new hardware, but it's just a good habit so you don't say, oh man, which spring went where again? Because they are different designs. Now we can take this top shoe away from the top notch. So do the same on the back and let that down. Now you'll notice the adjuster and the spring that holds the bottom shoes together. Good way to get that out. Turn it just like that. Take the adjuster out, making sure you know what side you just took off. So the threaded side is to the rear of the vehicle, and that does matter because this will spin and adjust the parking brakes, and if it's in reverse, it'll de-adjust the parking brake, so it'll never be properly adjusted. So pay attention to how that adjuster comes out. We know that the studded thread is to the rear of the car. And this spring goes on the bottom. So now on this particular make and model, there is not that typical horseshoe clip that you see going on there. There's nothing. You're just going to pull that off and clean it up after. One other thing you want to take out and keep an eye on how it came out is this actual upper adjuster. It's a spacer, and you'll see one side's wider than the other and one single slot here. This is this way for a particular reason, and you want it on the rear shoe, facing the rear shoe, and the hub. See how the cutout for the axle? It's got that roundness to it. So that's the way it would go in. Particularly wider opening goes to the rear. We'll set that aside. We're going to remove the pins because they're old and rusty, and I am replacing the hardware. So they just slide out through the back of the backing plate. And we'll just measure them, make sure they're the same length, there was no front or back, set them aside. So now I'm going to take this bracket off the parking brake cable. So the best way I know how is if you have two pairs of cutters, it works, but you're not going to squeeze hard enough to cut anything. So you just want to like give it a space. Now I don't have two pairs right here, so I'm going to use a fuel line tool that I have, but it's shaped like a V. I want to get that so I can get this in there. Slide that out, just like that, and then release it. Now we're going to move on to taking the mounting of this cable from the backing plate and just the support bracket to this arm off. 10mm socket. I'm going to grab it and just see if we can, don't forget to move the hub so it opens up and get your tool in there. Nice, there's one. And then follow the cable down to where it mounts, right here, 10mm socket. 2. Now we can grab that cable. You might need to get a little brass punch and a hammer. Oh, I got it. Just pull it right out of that backing plate, let it hang down. Now we're going to remove the ABS sensor. That mounting bolt is a 10mm socket. Get in there and remove that. And then just grab that sensor and slide it out. If it's stuck in there real good, sometimes I'll take a pair of pliers, squeeze it, and pull on it. We're going to follow it over to the mounting bracket that's right here on this arm. That's another 10mm socket. We'll get in there and remove that. It's just a nut. Pull that bracket out. Now we're going to pull this and just get it clear from that knuckle. We're going to move on to taking the axle nut out. And this is a 30mm socket, but it has to be a 12 point. So you want it to make sure it has all those little 12 points on it. Set it up, and we're going to reverse it right off. Now with a 17mm socket and a wrench, I'm going to hold the nut side, and I'm going to take the socket, take the bolt out. All right, so we've done our best, and now we know that the bolt is seized in here. We've tried heat, air chisel, so now I'm going to have to cut this bolt out and get the correct one ordered coming in. So if yours is like this, go ahead and cut it out, but pre-order the bolt because it has to be a special bolt. It is a suspension bolt. Now with a 17mm socket, we're going to dismount this lower shock bracket to the knuckle. There's two bolts right here. Just want it away from the actual knuckle, so when we pull it out, it's out of the way. So now we're going to loosen up the sway bar link to this lower control arm, and this nut is a 17mm socket, and we're just going to dismount the whole thing. That's all we need to do. We don't need to touch the top. 17mm socket and a 17mm wrench on the back side. We're not removing it, we're just loosening it. Enough for it to pivot. Now I'm going to loosen up this bolt before I lower it. And the nut on the back side is fixed. It's part of the control arm. So 17mm. Now we'll lower it and support it by a floor jack and go from there. Now we're going to grab the floor jack. I just put a piece of wood on there for safety, keep it from sliding. We're going to support this lower control arm. Now we can pull this bolt out, and there'll be a little tension on that spring so it doesn't just fall out. This is when I'll take a wrench, pull on it. Now we can let it down slowly. Grab that spring, pull it up out of the way. Now with it getting pretty set to come down, I want to loosen up this shaft because I don't want to try to hold everything up and loosen the shaft at the same time. So I'm going to take a center punch, see if I can get this to move in a little bit. Perfect, that's exactly what I want to do. Now all we have to do is undo this control arm and the other lateral arm. So now we're going to take the nut off of this lateral arm or trailing arm. 17 millimeter socket, let's take the nut off. Set it aside. Now that's just like a tie rod end, so that's really pinched in there. So I'm going to get my tool and I'm going to separate that like a tuning fork or a ball joint fork. Now with like a ball joint fork, I'm just going to get right in here and separate it. All right, so it's hitting that. So now we just have to take these two bolts out and it should be ready to come out. So these two bolts are a 22 millimeter socket. Let's pull them out of the knuckle. There's one, and then the upper one. Get that control arm out of the way. Now this is going to weigh a lot, so and now you're just going to have to maneuver it out and bring it down. So now we're going to pop this axle out of that rear diff, and I'm going to use a pry bar, but you got to be careful because this is aluminum housing, so we don't want to chip it with a pry bar. So as delicately as possible, let's see if we can get in there. Give it a little pop. I'm going to use the CV axle fork. Now that it's broken free, you can kind of level it out a little bit and just get that pry bar and slowly guide it out. I don't want to hit that seal as much as possible and then guide that axle right out. Whenever installing a CV shaft, no matter whether it's a front axle or a rear, you have this lock clip and the opening's right there. Try to make sure that it's facing like 6 o'clock, sometimes even like a 3 or a 9, but never set that opening at 12 because you'll end up jamming this and it will never go in, you'll just keep bending it. So you want gravity to kind of help you along to ease it in there. Now we can guide it right through, line it up, and feel it center, and just give it a good push. So I like to level the CV shaft out. I'm going to get a rubber mallet and I'm just going to bonk it. And there it is, popped right in. Now we're going to install the knuckle back in. I'm going to take the new axle nut off. And I like to put a little bit of never seize so that the next person doesn't have to deal with a frozen axle in the spindle. So once I take this off, I'm just going to give it a quick coating. Now I'm going to lift that knuckle up. Go ahead and slide it on. Get my new axle nut. Start it. Okay, so the trailing arm right here, these two bolts, I'm going to raise it up and start them by hand. All right, so now I'm going to lift this knuckle up, and with my best, I'm going to dance around, pull this upper control arm up, kind of put it in that lateral arm. Let's try to get it to fall right into place. Start the top one by hand. Grab that bottom one, see if we can start that by hand. So now I'm going to take my 22 socket and I'm going to just slowly snug it up. Same with the top one. Now I'm going to get a 17mm socket and tighten this nut, 17mm. Now if that happens to you, what I like to do is just take a hammer, push it in, bottom it out. Now with a 22mm socket, I'm going to torque my 2 radius arm bolts or trailing arm bolts to 148 foot-pounds. There's one, and the top one. Two. Now with a 17mm socket, we're going to tighten this axle arm to 74 foot-pounds. Now our shock mount bracket to knuckle, 2 bolts, 17mm socket. You might have to compress the shock a little bit. I'm doing that right now. Got 1 bolt on. Second one, same 17mm socket. Start it by hand. I'm just gonna snug them up, then I'll torque them. And the torque for the lower shock mount to knuckle is 59 foot-pounds. Just double check. So make sure if your washer and bushing fell out of your sway bar link, make sure you put that on. You can hold it there. Put your spring in. Make sure the insulator, rubber insulator is mounted correctly. Bring that up, put that link through the hole. Now you can get your floor jack. Make sure your bottom spring is lined up properly. Get your floor jack in, support it. So now I'm just going to jack it up till I meet that lower knuckle bushing and line it up. Might need to manipulate it a little bit, like that. There we go. Nice. Take our bolt, give it a little pull. Perfect. Start it by hand. Take my 17mm socket, go ahead and snug it up. Just snug it up. Now we're going to put our sway bar link together, bushing first, then washer, and start the nut. So before we torque the lower control arm and the sway bar link back up, it has to be at the proper ride height level. So we're going to get a pole jack. You can use a floor jack, anything, but you want to bring this up to the proper level so it's ride height, just as if the weight of the car was on it, before you torque that down. So now we can torque this and torque these 2 bolts to the proper specs. So I'm going to snug this link up a little bit more That's a 16 millimeter wrench to hold that stud. It shouldn't move, and 17 millimeter socket. Now we're going to torque it to 55 foot-pounds. Both bolts for the lower control arm are 66 foot-pounds, and that's a 17 millimeter socket and wrench on the inner bolt. $17mm and 66 foot-pounds. That has a fixed nut on the control arm, so you don't need to put a wrench on it. So now we can lower this pull jack or your floor jack, whichever you used. Now, if you notice, this upper control arm bushing is a pivot bushing, and I want to angle it now while I can. Get it to line up a little bit nicer while we try to put that in there. Now, in order to line up that upper control arm bolt into that knuckle, I'm going to need to push up on the suspension, at the same time be able to line it up. So the floor jack is the easiest way, I do believe. Now I've got to be able to push that in at the same time. So I'm wedging my pry bar in that knuckle like that, and I'm going to push inward and pull up on that control arm until I can get it to line up right. All right, so let's see if it goes through. Perfect. Now I'm going to install the nut. I'm going to leave that suspension jacked up to tighten that up. So we'll snug it up with a 17 millimeter wrench and socket, and we'll torque it to factory specs. Now we're going to torque the upper control arm bolt to knuckle 66 foot-pounds, both with 17 millimeters. Now we can line up that ABS sensor. I'm going to put the bracket through the trailing arm, put that nut on the other side. Grab that ABS sensor, put it right in that hole. Start the bolt by hand. I'm going to snug up that bracket first, 10 millimeter socket. And then we're going to snug up this. Now we're going to torque the ABS mounting bolt to 75 inch-pounds. Now we can bring that parking brake cable right through the back of the backing plate. Line up that housing, fits right in that slot. Take that little 6 millimeter bolt, start it by hand. And I'm going to go right to the bracket and mount that bracket. Put the bolt through. Get a 10 millimeter socket, and we're going to snug them up. I'm going to go over here to the housing. So line that cutout on that hub so you can put a socket in there, 10 millimeter. Just tighten it down. So now we're going to clean up that backing plate. I'm just going to take a little wire wheel brush, clean off the marking high points. You can't miss the high points. They're like little divots that the shoes will ride on. And I'm cleaning them up because I'm going to put a little bit of caliper grease on them for the rubbing part. Just get a little brake parts cleaner, clean it up. I have my catch basin below. Okay, we'll let that dry a little bit. Make sure it's dry. We're going to take some caliper grease, like I said. I'm just going to brush it on those high points. It just stops the shoes from being metal to metal against the backing plate. Could make a horrific noise. Plus it will wear that backing plate out. Then you'll have to replace that. We're going to put our adjuster arm in. Remember when we took it out, we put the Y part towards the rear of the car. I'm just going to let it sit right in there, right on that little hub. Now I'm going to take my new adjuster. 2 came in the package. So like I talked about earlier, you have different thread turning. You have clockwise and counterclockwise. And that's for the meaning of whether the shoe gets adjusted or de-adjusted. So I matched up the new adjuster to the one that I took out on this side. And I'm going to put some never sees on the threads part, so that way we'll have no problem in the future. Just take a little spray can, or you can have the paste. And I like to put it on the inside where the threads are. Now I can thread that back in. Bring it in as far as you need to. Take some of that excess. And I'm going to put that on this side. Spray a little bit in there. Because the head of that adjuster needs to spin freely too. Make sure it never seizes up on anyone. Now that's ready to go when we get to that point. So when it comes to parking brakes, unlike regular drum brakes, there is no primary or secondary brake shoe. That usually means one shoe is longer than the other, but these are all equal, so there's no front or back. So we're going to just grab one of them and get ready to put that e-brake pivot on, and I'm going to, right where it sits in there, I'm going to put some nice caliper grease to get that to stay spinning freely. I'm going to rest it the best I can while I get the rest of the hardware. Well, I'm going to have to hold it there and then take the pin and run the pin through the back. You can't miss the hole. It's right there, right by the actual caliper bracket mounting. Like that. Put your finger on it if you can. There we go. Now we have to put this spring and collapse it and turn that at the same time. Turn that just a little bit. I pried a pry bar in there to hold that pin, so now I can concentrate on the outside here and hope that I can get it by pushing down and spinning. Maybe give it a little bit of help. So now I'm going to go from that shoe and work my way around to the top to make it the easiest as possible. So remember, the threaded part goes towards the rear, and you're going to line it up in the shoe on that flat spot just like that, and the same with the other shoe. But before we do that, I want to put the spring in. Remember, the opening, the long part of that spring is going to go by that star adjuster. So this back part of the spring does not go in this hole, it goes in the slot. Now you grab your other shoe and the adjuster. First thing I do is I hook the spring up, put the lever in there, Now we just give it a pull and line it up. There we go. Go ahead and adjust that out. Once again, let's line that hub up so it's less troublesome. With the cutout right there, we're going to put this side, front side pin in through the hole in the backing plate and right through the shoe, like that. We'll get the spring, line that up. So now we can put our top springs on. You had the two different types, and I laid them out. So the weirdest looking one, if you want to call it that, goes to the rear. Doesn't matter which order you put them in, because they don't go over each other like some cars. Put it in that hole front there, and then I'm just going to grab my tool. You can use a screwdriver. I've seen people use many things. And it will fall right in. Just like that. Do the same to the back. Line it up in that hole. Grab your screwdriver or the brake tool. Put it over that. So now it's time to clean up the hub. I'm going to put my catch basin below it. First I'm going to clean off the grease that somebody added already in the last brake job. Even if yours is just rust, I recommend doing this just to get the rust loosened up, because you want a clean surface. Then take a wire brush and just start brushing it. The idea is to get the high rise chunks, or if of anything, off, because you don't want that hub sitting unevenly. And the most notorious spot is right here, the center part of that hub. And if you need to, you can always just grab your hand, feel for any rust spots. We're lucky this is pretty clean, and I'll take it. And I'll just clean it off again. Let that dry. So I'm going to spray the hub with some copper never seize. You can use the silver if you wish. It just stops that from rusting again. So now we can put our rotor back on. Make sure it sits. Make sure you can turn it. That's perfect. We'll adjust the parking shoes through this adjustment window once the caliper is back on. Now we can install our caliper. Take it off the hook. Line up the bracket. We have the two mounting bolts back here. Caliper bracket to knuckle. Starting by hand. That's a 17mm socket. We're going to take that and snug it up. Let's get the bottom one. And we're going to torque that to 65 foot-pounds. That's the little door for the adjustment for the parking brakes. Take it out now so you don't forget, and put it with the parts so you remember to put it back on. If not, water will get in there and it makes a mess out of the hub and the parking shoes, and that's not exactly the goal, is it? We're going to take a flathead screwdriver or an adjustment tool. We're going to go right in there and we're going to adjust those parking brakes, the shoes that go inside this hat. And nice quick way is you want a nice drag. So at 6 o'clock is where the star adjuster is, and you're going to turn it. You'll feel it getting tighter or looser. If it's looser, then go the opposite way. And you want it to have a nice slow drag. Not too tight, just right. Then you're going to put your boot back on. Now water won't get in there. So before we tighten our axle nut, I'm going to put the tire on so that way we can put it down and have proper weight on it to torque it. Hand start the lug nuts. Now with a 21 millimeter, we'll snug the lug nuts up. That lug nut, that stuff. So the new axle nut is a 32 millimeter, and we're going to torque this to 159 foot-pounds. While we're here, we'll torque our wheels. That's with the 21 millimeter socket, and the wheel torque is 76 foot-pounds. I'm going to do it in a crisscross or star pattern. Double check. So the last thing I want to do on this is that this type of axle nut doesn't have like a cotter pin, but it does have a little hammer-in spot. Sometimes you'll see that a lot. So I'm going to turn the wheel. I raise it up enough so I can turn it. I'll take a punch, and you just put it right on that spot, and then you hammer it down. That's all you have to do. And now it won't back off by accident. After finishing this installation, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle. When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.